The wind howling down from the granite peaks of the Sawtooth Range did not sound like merely moving air. It sounded like a warning. It was late in the year 1884. Winter had already laid its heavy white hand upon the territory, choking the passes and turning the streams into ribbons of black ice. In a high, lonesome valley some 10 miles from the town of Red Hollow, a single cabin stood against the gray sky. It was a sturdy structure, built of rough-hewn pine logs that had darkened with age and smoke, hunkered down low against the earth as if trying to avoid being swept away by the gales that tore through the canyon. Helen Mae Dawson stood on the porch, her breath pluming out before her in white clouds. She was 28 years old, though the harsh sun and the biting wind of the frontier had etched fine lines at the corners of her eyes that made her appear older. She was not a woman who owned silk dresses or ribbons. She wore a man's heavy wool coat that was 2 sizes too large, cinched at the waist with a leather belt, and beneath her heavy skirt, she wore boots that had been cobbled and patched more times than she cared to count. She lifted the heavy axe and brought it down with a practiced, fluid motion. The blade bit deep into the oak log, splitting it clean in two with a sharp crack that echoed off the valley walls. She did not grunt or sigh. She simply set up another log and swung again. Her hands were not the soft, pale hands of the ladies who sat on verandas in St. Louis or Boston. Her palms were calloused, hard as the handle of the axe she wielded. Her arms, hidden beneath the thick wool, were roped with lean muscle. There was a beauty to her. Certainly her hair was the color of wheat just before the harvest, and her eyes were a startling, clear gray, but it was a dangerous kind of beauty. It was the kind of beauty that made the men in Red Hollow look at her with a mixture of desire and unease. It made the women pull their shawls tighter and cross the street when she passed. She lived alone, in this country. For a woman to live alone was considered not just foolish, but an affront to the natural order of things. Helen stacked the split wood against the wall of the cabin, the rhythm of the work keeping the memories at bay. But the memories were always there, waiting in the silence. It had been 5 years since the fire, 5 years since the night the world ended. She could still smell the smoke if she closed her eyes. She could hear the roar of the flames that had consumed the main ranch house, the structure that had stood 100 yards from where her smaller cabin now sat. She remembered the heat, so intense it singed her eyebrows as she ran from the barn, screaming for Silas. Silas, her husband of only 2 years. He had been a good man, with a laugh that shook his whole belly and a dream of raising the finest cattle in the territory. He and his parents had been in the main house when it happened. The town sheriff, Harlan Pike, had stood over the smoking ruins the next morning, spitting tobacco juice into the ash. He had kicked a charred arrow point that lay near the porch, an arrow that looked suspiciously unlike the workmanship of the local tribes to anyone who knew better. But Harlan Pike was not a man who cared for details. Apaches, Pike had declared, his voice flat. Renegades coming down from the ridge. You're lucky they didn't drag you off. Helen. But Helen had seen no painted warriors. She had heard no war cries, only the crackle of timber and the scream of dying horses. Yet, the town had decided on the truth before the embers were cold, and with that decision came the stigma. Why had she survived? Why was she in the barn late at night when her husband was dying in his bed? The whispers started at the funeral. She brings bad luck. She carries a curse. God punished that house. But he left her behind. Helen finished the stack of wood. The sky to the north was turning a bruised, angry purple. A storm was coming. A big one. She needed to go into town one last time before the pass became impassable. She harnessed her mare, Bess, with efficient, unsentimental movements. The horse was old but steady, much like its mistress. Helen checked the saddlebags, ensuring she had the pelts she had trapped over the last month, beaver and fox. They would pay for the flour, coffee, and ammunition she needed to survive the month of isolation that was coming. The ride into Red Hollow took 3 hours. The town was a collection of clapboard buildings clinging to the muddy banks of the Red River, a scar of civilization on the face of the wilderness. As Helen rode down the main street, the activity seemed to pause. A blacksmith stopped his hammering. Two women sweeping a boardwalk ceased their chatter and watched her ride by, their eyes hard and judging. Helen kept her chin high, looking neither left nor right. She tied Bess in front of Kellum's general store and stepped inside. The warmth of the stove hit her, smelling of sawdust, tobacco, and dried apples. Martha Kellum, a large woman with a face like a sour lemon, was behind the counter. She stiffened when she saw Helen. "Helen Dawson?" Martha said, her tone devoid of welcome. "I thought you might have frozen to death up there by now." "Not yet, Martha," Helen replied, her voice cool and steady. "I have furs to trade, and I need a sack of flour, 5 pounds of coffee, salt pork, and a box of .45 caliber rounds." Martha sniffed, wiping her hands on her apron. "Sheriff Pike says there is a blizzard coming. Says it might bury the whole valley. A Christian woman would have moved into the boarding house for the winter. But then, I suppose you prefer the company of ghosts." "I prefer the company of silence," Helen said, placing the furs on the counter, while Martha counted out the trade credit with agonizing slowness, purposefully undervaluing the prime beaver pelts. The bell above the door jingled. 2 men walked in, bringing a gust of freezing air with them. One was Sheriff Harlan Pike, a man whose belly strained against his vest buttons and whose eyes were perpetually narrowed in suspicion. The other was Elias Crow. Crow was a contrast to the rough-hewn men of the town. He wore a suit of fine broadcloth and a hat that cost more than Helen's horse. He was the wealthiest rancher in the district, a man whose ambition was as vast as the open range. He wanted land. Specifically, he wanted Helen's land. "Mrs. Dawson," Crow said, lifting his hat slightly. His smile did not reach his eyes. "A pleasure, as always. Though I must say, you look thin. The valley life is hard on a delicate constitution." Helen took her sack of flour from the counter. "My constitution is fine, Mr. Crow, and the answer is still no." Crow chuckled, a dry sound like dry leaves skittering on stone. "I have not even asked the question today. Helen." "You want to buy the deed," Helen said, hoisting the heavy sack onto her shoulder with ease. "You want to offer me 20 cents on the dollar, tell me it is for my own good, and ship me off to a city back east. I am saving you the breath." Sheriff Pike stepped forward, his thumbs hooked in his gun belt. "Now, Helen, there is no need to be rude. Elias is making a generous offer. That land of yours, it is dangerous ground. We have had reports. Apache sign found near the creek." Helen looked at Pike, her gray eyes piercing. "I have lived there alone for 5 years. Sheriff, I have never seen an Apache on my land. The only tracks I see are from cattle thieves and wolves." "Things change," Pike said, his voice dropping to a low, threatening rumble. "A woman alone, with savages roaming about. We cannot guarantee your safety out there. The town council worries. The town council worries about what Elias Crow tells them to worry about," Helen said. She turned to Martha. "Put the rest of the credit on a tab. I will be back in the spring." She walked out, feeling their eyes boring into her back like hot nails. As she secured the supplies to her saddle, she realized she had forgotten the box of matches. Cursing softly, she moved to go back inside, but stopped near the side of the building where the wood was stacked. The voices drifted through the thin glass of the side window. "Stubborn as a mule," Pike's voice grumbled. "She is in the way. Harlan." Elias Crow's voice was smooth, deadly calm. "The surveyors are coming through in the spring. The railroad does not wait for grieving widows. If the rail line has to divert around her valley, it will cost me thousands." "I told her about the Apaches," Pike said. "Words do not scare a woman like that." Crow replied, "She needs a demonstration. If a few Apaches were to pay her a visit, burn a shed, scatter the livestock, she would come running to sell that deed before the ink was dry. The council would have legal grounds to remove her for her own protection. It is risky. Elias, if she gets hurt—" "She won't get hurt if she leaves," Crow said coldly. "And if she stays, well, accidents happen in the West every day." Helen stood frozen in the snow, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. It was not just greed. It was a conspiracy. They were planning to terrorize her, perhaps even kill her, just to clear the path for iron rails and steam engines. She wanted to burst back in, to scream at them, to brandish the pistol she carried under her coat. But she knew better. Who would listen to the mad widow of Red Hollow Pike was the law, and Crow was the money. She quietly retreated to her horse, her hands trembling as she tightened the cinch. She mounted Bess and spurred the mare into a trot, desperate to put miles between herself and the poisonous atmosphere of the town. The ride back was a race against the heavens. The purple clouds had turned a deep, bruised black. The wind had picked up, screaming through the pines, driving icy needles of snow into her face. By the time Helen reached the turnoff to her valley, the world had turned white. The familiar landmarks were vanishing behind a curtain of driving snow. She navigated by instinct and the memory of 5 years of solitude. When the cabin finally loomed out of the whiteness, it looked small and insignificant against the wrath of the storm. But to Helen, it was a fortress. It was the only thing she had left. That land was not just dirt and grass. It was where Silas was buried. It was the place where they had whispered promises to each other in the dark. Selling it to Elias Crow would be like selling the bones of her husband. She stabled Bess in the small barn, rubbing the mare down with dry straw and giving her an extra portion of oats. "Eat up, girl," she whispered, her voice sounding small in the vast, howling night. "It is going to be a long night." She barred the barn door from the outside and fought her way through the wind to the cabin. Inside, the air was cold, but still. She lit the kerosene lamp, the golden glow pushing back the shadows. She moved with the frantic energy of fear. She checked the heavy wooden bar across the front door. She checked the shutters on the windows, ensuring the latches were tight. She built the fire up in the hearth until it roared, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. She took her husband's Winchester repeating rifle from the rack above the mantel. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, a box of cleaning rags and oil beside her. Slowly, methodically, she began to clean the weapon. "They want to scare me away," she thought, her jaw tightening. Let them come. Let them come in their masks and their lies. But underneath the anger, there was a hollow ache. The loneliness usually waited until the work was done to creep in. But tonight, with the threat of violence hanging over her and the storm raging outside, the isolation felt physical. It was a weight on her chest. She realized that if she died out here tonight, whether by the cold or by the hands of Crow's hired men, no one would know until the spring thaw. No one would mourn. Martha Kellum would likely nod and say it was God's judgment. Elias Crow would simply step over her frozen body to sign the deed. The wind slammed against the cabin wall, making the timbers groan. It sounded like a giant fist striking the wood. Helen stopped cleaning the rifle. She listened. There was only the wind. She told herself she was strong. She had survived the fire. She had survived 5 winters alone. She did not need anyone. She had convinced herself that solitude was a shield, that by keeping the world out, she could not be hurt again. She walked to the window and peered through a crack in the shutter. Outside, there was nothing but a swirling vortex of white and black. The world had disappeared. It was just her, the fire, and the rifle. "I am safe," she whispered to the empty room. "I am safe because I'm alone." She placed the rifle on the table, next to a half-eaten loaf of bread and a tin cup of coffee. She sat in the rocking chair near the fire, wrapping a quilt around her shoulders. She would not sleep tonight. She would keep watch. The hours ticked by. The storm intensified, the noise becoming a deafening roar that seemed to vibrate in her very bones. And then she heard it. It was not the wind. It was not the settling of the logs. It was a sound that had no business existing in a blizzard of this magnitude. In a valley this remote, at this hour of the night, thud, thud, thud. 3 distinct, heavy knocks on the front door. Helen froze. The rocking chair stopped its creak. Her hand flew to the grip of the revolver tucked into her belt, her eyes widening in the firelight. It could not be. No human being could be out in this. It had to be a branch. It had to be the wind playing tricks on a tired mind. Thud, thud, louder this time, more insistent. Crow's men had they come already, but even hired killers would not ride in a storm that could freeze a man's blood in his veins in 10 minutes. Helen stood up, the quilt falling to the floor. She picked up the Winchester and levered around into the chamber with a metallic clack-clack that sounded like a gunshot in the small room. She moved to the door, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it might break them. She stood to the side of the frame, pressing her back against the rough logs. "Who is there?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly before she steeled it. "I am armed. Get away!" There was a silence, long and heavy, broken only by the screaming wind. Then a voice came through the thick wood of the door. It was deep, guttural, and strained, shouting to be heard over the gale. "Help! Please!" It was not the voice of Elias Crow. It was not the sneering tone of Sheriff Pike. It was a voice filled with a desperate, raw exhaustion. Helen hesitated. Every instinct she had honed over 5 years of survival screamed at her to keep the bar in place, to ignore the voice, to stay safe in her fortress of solitude. Opening that door meant letting the winter in. Opening that door meant breaking the seal she had placed on her life. But she remembered the heat of the fire 5 years ago. She remembered running, screaming for help, and no one coming until it was too late. Her hand moved to the heavy wooden bar. Her fingers curled around the rough timber. She took a breath, a sharp intake of air that tasted of wood smoke and fear. She lifted the bar. With a deep groan of protest from the hinges, Helen unlatched the door and pulled it open just a crack. The force of the blizzard slammed against it, tearing the handle from her grip and flinging the door wide open. Snow exploded into the room, swirling instantly around the floorboards, threatening to snuff out the lantern. The cold was a physical blow, shocking and immediate. Helen raised the rifle, squinting against the blinding white that flooded her vision. Standing in the doorway, framed by the swirling chaos of the night, was a nightmare, or perhaps a god. He was massive. He had to duck his head to keep from hitting the top of the doorframe. He was broad-shouldered, his chest bare beneath an open buffalo hide coat that was crusted with ice. His skin was bronze, though now pale with deadly cold. Long black hair whipped around a face that looked like it had been carved from the mountain stone itself, sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw, and eyes that burned with a fierce, terrifying intensity. He was Apache, the very word that the town used to frighten children, the monsters Pike had warned her about. But he was not attacking. Helen's eyes traveled down. The giant was not holding a weapon. He was holding he was supporting another man, a smaller, older man, whose gray hair was matted with snow, and whose head lolled against the giant's massive chest. The old man was slumped, his legs barely holding his weight, wrapped in thin blankets that offered no protection against the death outside. The giant warrior took a step forward, crossing the threshold of her sanctuary. He did not look at the rifle pointed at his heart. He looked straight into Helen's eyes. There were scars on his chest, white jagged lines against the bronze skin, and fresh scratches on his arms. He looked wild, dangerous, and utterly desperate. He spoke, his English accented but clear, his voice rumbling like the earth moving deep underground. "Can we stay one night?" He did not beg. He did not demand it. He asked with the dignity of a king who has lost his kingdom but not his pride. Helen stood there, the snow swirling around her skirts, the cold biting into her skin. The rifle felt heavy in her hands. In front of her was everything she had been told to hate, everything she had been told to fear, the supposed architects of her widowhood. But as she looked at the old man shivering violently in the giant's arms, and the look of sheer, terrifying protectiveness in the younger man's eyes, something inside her chest, that hard, cold knot she had carried for 5 years, began to loosen. She lowered the barrel of the rifle just an inch. The wind howled, waiting for her answer. The silence that followed the giant's request was heavier than the storm raging outside. Helen stood paralyzed, her knuckles white where she gripped the lever of the Winchester. The wind shrieked through the open door, carrying snow that hissed as it hit the hot iron of the stove behind her. She did not feel the cold. All she could feel was the thundering of her own heart against her ribs. Can we stay one night? The question hung in the air, simple and devastating. Her mind was a chaotic battlefield. On one side stood the sheriff, Martha Kellum, and the entire population of Red Hollow. Their voices screamed in her memory. Savages, murderers, they burned your husband, they will cut your throat while you sleep. Every instinct of self-preservation she had honed over 5 years of solitude told her to pull the trigger. She had the drop on him. At this range, she could not miss. But then there was the other side. She looked at the man in the giant's arms. Greyhawk, he would later be called, though she did not know his name yet. He was small, frail, and shaking so violently that his teeth chattered with a sound like dry bones rattling in a cup. His face was gray, the color of old ash, and his eyes were rolled back, seeing nothing but the fever that consumed him. He was not a warrior at that moment. He was a father. He was a dying old man. Helen looked back up at the giant. Dasan. He had not moved. He had not flinched at the rifle barrel aimed at his chest. Water dripped from his long black hair, running down the sharp planes of his face and over the jagged white scars that mapped his broad, bronze shoulders. His eyes, dark as obsidian, held hers. There was no malice in them. There was a terrifying resolve. Yes, and a deep, simmering anger that seemed directed at the world itself. But beneath that, she saw a desperate plea. He was asking for mercy. Helen Dawson had not received much mercy in her life. The town had given her none. The winter had given her none. But as she looked at the water pooling around his moccasins, mixing with the snow on her floorboards, she realized she was not Harlan Pike. She was not Elias Crow. If she turned them away now, if she let the storm claim them, she would be no better than the people who had ostracized her. The ghost of her husband, Silas, seemed to whisper in the back of her mind. It is a hard country. Helen, but we do not have to be difficult people. Slowly, agonizingly. Helen lowered the rifle. She did not set it down, but she pointed the barrel toward the floor. She stepped aside, clearing the threshold. Come in, she said. Her voice was brittle, cracking like dry kindling. Before you freeze us both. Dasan did not smile. He simply nodded, a sharp, singular motion of gratitude. He stepped inside, ducking his head low to clear the lintel. The cabin, which had felt spacious enough for Helen alone, suddenly shrank. He was enormous. As he straightened up, the top of his head nearly brushed the rough-hewn beams of the ceiling. His shoulders seemed to span the width of the entryway. He carried the old man as if he weighed no more than a child. Helen quickly pushed the heavy door shut against the wind, dropping the thick wooden bar back into place with a solid thud. The sudden silence was jarring. The roar of the blizzard was instantly muffled, replaced by the crackle of the fire and the heavy, ragged breathing of the old man. Put him there, Helen commanded, pointing to the rug made of braided rags in front of the hearth. Near the fire, but not too close. Dasan knelt, his movements surprisingly fluid and gentle for a man of such immense size. He laid his father down on the rug. The old man groaned, a low, pained sound that tore at Helen's composure. She watched them for a moment, the rifle still clutched in her hand. The reality of what she had done crashed over her. She had let 2 Apache men into her home. She was a white woman, a widow, alone in a valley miles from help, with the very people she was supposed to fear most. But fear was quickly being replaced by practicality. She saw Dasan shivering. The buffalo coat he wore was soaked through, heavy and freezing. Beneath it, his chest was bare, and the skin was covered in goose flesh. There are blankets in the chest at the foot of the bed, Helen said, keeping her distance, her back pressed against the wall near the door. And water in the bucket. Dasan looked at her. Thank you. His voice was deep, resonating in the small timber room. He moved to the chest, and Helen found herself holding her breath. He moved with the grace of a mountain cat, silent despite his bulk. He retrieved 2 heavy wool blankets. He did not take one for himself. He returned to the fire and stripped the wet layers from his father, wrapping the old man efficiently in the dry wool. Only then did he shrug off his own heavy coat. Helen tried to look away, but her eyes betrayed her. Dasan stood by the fire, the orange light dancing across his skin. He was a landscape of muscle and scars. His back was broad and tapering, the muscles shifting like steel cables under bronze skin as he wrung out his wet hair. There was a long, pale scar running from his left shoulder blade down to his ribs, a souvenir of some past violence. Another marred his bicep. He was terrifying. He was magnificent. Helen felt a flush of heat rise up her neck that had nothing to do with the stove. It was a sensation she had not felt in years. A sudden, sharp awareness of the male form. Living alone, her world had become devoid of this particular energy, the smell of wet leather, wood smoke, and male sweat. It filled the cabin, thick and undeniable. She felt a strange tightening in her stomach, a mixture of anxiety and a primal, unwanted curiosity. She gripped the rifle tighter, using the cold steel to ground herself. Is he sick with the pox?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. Dasan turned to face her. The firelight caught the high planes of his cheekbones. "No, not the pox. Winter sickness. His lungs are weak. We have been walking for 3 days in the snow." "Walking?" Helen asked. "You have no horses." "Our horses were shot," Dasan said. His face darkened, his jaw tightening until a muscle jumped in his cheek. He did not elaborate. Helen walked to the stove, keeping the table between them. She poured a tin cup of coffee from the pot she had kept warm. She slid it across the table toward him. "Drink," she said. "It is black. I have no sugar." Dasan took the cup. His hands were large, swallowing the tin vessel. He took a long swallow, not flinching at the heat. "It is good." "Where are you going?" Helen asked. "This is not reservation land. If the sheriff finds you here—" "We are going south," Dasan interrupted, his voice low. "To the mountains of Mexico, to the old places. We do not want trouble with your sheriff. We only want to keep the old man alive." He knelt back down beside his father, lifting the old man's head to give him a sip of the coffee. The tenderness in his hands was a stark contrast to the violence written on his skin. Helen watched, her heart slowly unclenching. They are just men, she told herself. Just men trying to survive the cold, but the world outside did not see it that way. "You are safe here tonight," Helen said, the words feeling strange on her tongue. "The storm will hide you, but the snow will be deep tomorrow." Dasan looked up at her. "We will clear your path before we go, to pay for the fire." Helen nodded. She needed to do something. The tension in the room was too thick. The way Dasan filled the space was overwhelming her senses. Every time he moved, the air seemed to shift. She needed a moment of cold reality. "I need to check the barn," she lied. "The latch on the mare's stall is loose." "In this wind?" Dasan asked, his brow furrowing. "I will be quick," she said. She grabbed her heavy coat from the peg, shrugged it on, and pulled her hat low. She did not take the rifle. It was a gesture of trust, terrifying and calculated. She left the weapon leaning against the wall. If he wanted to kill her, he could have done it already. She unbarred the door and slipped out. The wind hit her like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. She fought her way across the small yard to the barn, her boots sinking deep into the fresh drifts. She slipped inside the barn, the smell of hay and horse manure a familiar comfort. Bess, the mare, nickered softly in the darkness. "It is all right, girl," Helen whispered, stroking the horse's velvet nose. "We have guests. Can you believe it?" She stood there for a moment in the dark, letting her heart beat slow. She was crazy. The whole town was right. She was mad. She had let a giant Apache warrior sleep by her fire. She moved to the barn door, intending to head back, but something caught her eye, through a gap in the barn boards. She looked out toward the ridge that overlooked her valley. The snow was driving hard, obscuring almost everything, but for a brief second, the wind shifted the curtain of white. Up on the hillside, perhaps a quarter of a mile away, a tiny point of light flickered. It flared orange, just for a heartbeat, and then vanished. Helen froze. It was not a star. The clouds were too thick. It was not lightning. It was the flare of a match. Someone was up there. Someone was watching the cabin. A chill that had nothing to do with the blizzard raced down her spine. Harlan Pike had warned her about Apaches, but the Apaches were inside her house, drinking her coffee. The danger was out there, in the dark. Crow, she thought, or his men. They were watching to see if she would break. They were waiting for the storm to do their work for them. Or perhaps they were waiting for something else. If they saw Dasan, if Elias Crow knew she was harboring 2 Apache men, he would not just drive her off the land. He would hang her. He would bring the whole town down on this valley with ropes and torches. She extinguished the thought. She could not panic. Not now. She pushed the barn door open and fought her way back to the cabin. She slipped inside, bolting the door behind her with trembling hands. The scene inside was peaceful. Greyhawk was asleep, his breathing still raspy but rhythmic. Dasan was sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, his long legs stretched out, whittling a piece of firewood with a large hunting knife. He stopped when she entered, his dark eyes assessing her face. He saw the fear there. "What is it?" he asked. "Nothing." Helen lied, shedding her coat. She could not tell him. If she told him there were men on the hill, he might go out there, he might kill them, or be killed. And then there would be no going back. Just the wind. "It is getting worse." Dasan studied her for a moment longer, his gaze penetrating. He knew she was holding something back, but he did not press. He sheathed the knife. "The old man sleeps," he said. "You should sleep too." Helen said, "You can take the rug. I will take the bed. I will sleep by the door." Dasan said, it was not a suggestion. It was a statement of guard duty. Helen moved to her narrow bed in the corner of the room. She kept her boots on. She lay down on top of the quilt, pulling a second blanket over herself. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. The room was dark now, save for the orange glow of the embers. Helen lay on her side, facing the room. She could see the dark shape of Dasan sitting near the door, his head tipped back against the logs, his breathing slow and deep. The cabin, usually so empty and echoing, felt full. It felt charged with a strange, electric energy. She could hear the breathing of 2 men. She could smell the damp wool and the faint, copper scent of the exhaustion that clung to them. For 5 years, she had slept in a tomb of silence. Now, there was life. She thought of the light on the hill. She thought of the scars on Dasan's chest. She thought of the way his hands had looked when he held the cup of coffee. She closed her eyes, but sleep did not come. She lay there, listening to the wind howl its impotent rage against the walls, acutely aware that the storm outside was nothing compared to the storm that had just begun inside her life. The world had shifted on its axis. The isolation was broken. And as she drifted into a shallow, uneasy doze, she realized with a jolt that for the first time in 5 years, she was not afraid of the ghosts in the dark. She was afraid for the living. The storm had broken in the night, leaving behind a world sculpted in blinding white marble. Helen woke to a silence so profound it felt heavy on her eardrums. The howling wind that had battered the cabin for 24 hours was gone, replaced by the stillness of a frozen morning. She lay under her quilts for a moment, her breath misting in the frigid air of the room. Listening, she heard the rhythmic rasp of a whetstone on steel. She sat up, clutching the quilt to her chest. The fire had been built up. Fresh logs crackled and popped in the hearth, throwing warmth into the small space. On the rug, the old man, Greyhawk, was asleep, though his breathing was shallow and rattled with the wet sound of fluid in the lungs. She looked toward the door. It was open. Helen scrambled out of bed, her feet finding her boots instantly. She grabbed her heavy shawl and stepped out onto the porch, squinting against the glare of the morning sun hitting the snow. Dasan was there. He was repairing the hinge of the barn door, which the wind had nearly torn free in the night. He had shed the heavy buffalo coat. He wore a buckskin shirt that was darkened with sweat down the spine, despite the biting cold. As he lifted the heavy oak door with one hand to align the pin, Helen saw the muscles of his back shift and coil like snakes beneath the leather. He was power-made manifest raw, unbridled strength that seemed to belong more to the mountains than to the world of men. He sensed her presence and turned. His face was stoic, but the dark eyes swept over her with an intensity that made her conscious of her disheveled hair and the sleep still in her eyes. "The storm is done," he said. His voice was deep, vibrating in the morning air. "Yes," Helen replied, pulling her shawl tighter. "But the sickness is not—" As if on cue, a fit of coughing erupted from inside the cabin. It was a terrible, hacking sound that seemed to tear at the old man's chest. Helen and Dasan moved inside simultaneously. Greyhawk was curled on his side, his body shuddering with the force of the spasms. When he finally stopped, he lay limp, his skin burning with a fever that radiated heat even through the blankets. Helen knelt beside him, placing a hand on his forehead. It was like touching a stove lid. "He needs more than fire and rest," Helen said, looking up at Dasan. "He needs medicine, laudanum for the cough, quinine for the fever, and maybe a poultice that I do not have the herbs to make." Dasan's face hardened. "We will find herbs in the forest." "Look outside. Dasan," Helen said, her voice sharp with reality. "The snow is 3 feet deep. The plants are buried. If we do not get help, he will not last another night." Dasan stood to his full height, filling the room with his refusal. "No white doctor will touch him. They will let him die, or they will kill him faster." "I know them," Helen countered, standing up to face him. She had to crane her neck to look him in the eye. "They are hard people, but the doctor in Red Hollow is a man of science. He will sell us what we need, but we have to go to him." "We?" Dasan asked. "You should stay here. Keep your door barred." "You cannot walk into Red Hollow alone," Helen said. "Not like this. Not with the town on edge. If you walk in there carrying a sick man, Sheriff Pike will shoot you before you reach the main street. With me, they might hesitate." Dasan looked at his father, then at Helen. He saw the resolve in her gray eyes. He saw that she was right. Greyhawk opened his eyes. They were glassy and rimmed with red. He reached out a trembling hand and gripped Dasan's wrist. "The woman speaks truth," the old man whispered, his voice like dry leaves. "To be a warrior is to know when to fight and when to endure." Dasan closed his eyes for a second, a flicker of pain crossing his features. Then he nodded. "We go." The journey down the mountain was a slow, agonizing procession through a world of white. They took Bess, the mare, but the snowdrifts on the narrow trail were too treacherous for the horse to carry a rider. Instead, they loaded the saddlebags with pelts to trade, and they walked. Helen walked in the middle. Greyhawk leaned heavily on her right shoulder. His arm draped across her back. She wrapped her arm around his waist, taking his weight with a strength she had forged over 5 years of solitude. On the other side, Dasan moved like a wolf, breaking the trail through the drifts, his eyes constantly scanning the ridgelines and the tree line. The sun was high and bright, offering no warmth but plenty of blinding light. Helen felt the old man shivering against her side. She was the bridge. She was the buffer between the dying culture of the man on her right and the encroaching, steel-hard civilization awaiting them in the valley. They reached the outskirts of Red Hollow just after noon. The town was digging itself out. Men were shoveling snow from boardwalks. Smoke curled from chimneys. But as the trio turned onto the main thoroughfare, the activity stopped. It started at the blacksmith shop. The hammering ceased. Then the conversation in front of the barber shop died, one by one. Heads turned. The silence that fell over Red Hollow was louder than the storm had been. They were a sight that defied the natural order of the town. A white woman, the cursed widow Dawson, walking shoulder to shoulder with 2 Apaches. Dasan loomed over them all, his presence radiating a dangerous energy that made men step back and put their hands near their holsters. Mothers grabbed their children and pulled them behind their skirts. Eyes peered from behind lace curtains. As they passed the general store, Martha Kellum came out into her porch with a broom. She stopped mid-sweep, her mouth falling open before snapping shut in a grim line. "Well," Martha's voice rang out, sharp and clear in the quiet street. "I always said Helen May was strange. Now we know why she stays up in that cabin. She finally found someone willing to warm her bed. Shame it had to be savage." Helen stiffened, her face burning, but she did not stop walking. Dassan's hand moved instinctively to the knife at his belt, but Helen grabbed his arm with her free hand, squeezing hard. "Keep walking," she whispered. "Do not give them the excuse." They did not make it to the doctor's office. Sheriff Harlan Pike stepped out of the jailhouse, blocking their path. He wore his tin star polished bright, and his thumbs were hooked into his gun belt, hovering near the walnut grips of his revolver. "Hold it right there," Pike rumbled. Helen stopped. Dassan stopped, positioning himself slightly in front of his father, shielding the old man with his massive body. "What is this?" "Helen May," Pike asked, his eyes flicking between Dassan's scars and Helen's defiant face. "You bringing strays into town now? We have ordinances against vagrants, especially the red kind." "This man is sick." "Sheriff," Helen said, her voice steady despite the trembling of her legs. "We are going to the doctor. We have furs to pay for medicine. We are not looking for trouble. You brought trouble with you when you rode in." Pike sneered. "We do not want their kind here. They spread disease, they steal. And I seem to recall a burnt ranch house that had their mark on it." Dassan said nothing, but his gaze bored into Pike. It was a look of pure, unadulterated contempt that made the sheriff shift his weight uneasily. Then, the door to the land office opened, and Elias Crow stepped out. He was immaculate in a charcoal suit, untouched by the labor of the snow. He smelled of bay rum and expensive tobacco. He stood behind Pike, looking at the scene with the detached interest of a man inspecting livestock. "Sheriff, surely we can be charitable," Crow said smoothly. He walked down the steps, ignoring the Apaches entirely and focusing his gaze on Helen. "Mrs. Dawson seems to have found herself in a predicament. Stay out of this." "Crow," Helen said. Crow smiled, a thin stretching of lips. "I'm only trying to help." "Helen, it must be a burden, living up there alone, so desperate for companionship that you take in refugees. It is dangerous. You see how the town looks at you. They are frightened. Fear makes people do rash things." He took a step closer, lowering his voice so only Helen could hear. "Get rid of them. Helen, I can have my boys escort them. Somewhere else. Far away. You do not need this burden. And in exchange, perhaps you and I can go inside and finally sign those papers. I will even raise my offer by 10%, enough to get you a ticket to San Francisco, away from all this snow and hate." Helen looked at Crow. She saw the greed swimming in his eyes. He did not care about the Apache threat. He did not care about the safety of the town. He saw Greyhawk not as a dying human being, but as leverage, a tool to pry her off the land that blocked his railroad. A spark of fury ignited in her chest. It was hotter than the shame, hotter than the fear. "My land is not for sale." "Elias," Helen said, her voice ringing out so the onlookers could hear. "And neither is my decency. These men are my guests. If the laws of this town say I cannot buy medicine for a dying guest, then this town is not fit to call itself civilized." She pushed past Pike. The sheriff bristled, his hand closing around his gun grip, but he did not draw. There were too many witnesses, and Helen Dawson, for all her eccentricity, was still a white woman. Shooting her in broad daylight was not something he could explain away easily. They reached the mercantile that doubled as the apothecary. The clerk, a balding man named Mr. Henderson, looked terrified as Dassan squeezed through the door. "We need quinine," Helen demanded, placing her beaver pelts on the counter. "And laudanum, and willow bark if you have it." Henderson swallowed hard. "Prices have gone up, Mrs. Dawson, storm and all." "These pelts are worth $20, Helen said. "The medicine costs $5, Henderson said, his eyes darting to the window where Pike and Crow were watching. "For the trouble, And I do not want them touching anything. Helen slammed her hand on the counter. Take it. She grabbed the bottles and the small packet of bark. She felt the injustice of it stinging her eyes like smoke. They were punishing her. They were making her pay for her humanity. As they exited the store, the wind picked up again, blowing snow dust down the street. The crowd had not dispersed. They watched in sullen silence. Helen helped Greyhawk back toward where Bess was tied. As she adjusted the saddlebags, she felt a tug on her skirt. She looked down. A small boy, no more than 8 years old, with a face wrapped in a woolen scarf, was standing there. He had patches on his knees and eyes that were wide with wonder, not hate. He held out a small cloth sack. "Ma'am," he whispered, "for the old one. My PA says Apaches are devils, but he looks cold." Helen took the sack. Inside were 3 hardtack biscuits, dry and plain, but to her they looked like gold. "Thank you," she whispered, tears pricking her eyes. "What is your name?" "Timmy," the boy said. Then, seeing his mother pushing through the crowd toward him, he turned and ran. Helen looked at Dasan. He had seen it too. The hardness in his face had cracked, just a fraction. "Not all of them are blind," Helen said softly. Dasan grunted. One spark does not warm the winter. But he took the biscuits and tucked them gently into his pocket. They left Red Hollow under the gaze of 100 eyes. As they began the long climb back up the valley trail, the sun began to dip toward the western peaks, casting long, blue shadows across the snow. Helen felt exhausted. The confrontation had drained her more than the walk, but as the silence of the wilderness wrapped around them again, she felt a strange new strength. She had stood up to them. She had chosen her side. Halfway up the rise, the wind shifted, carrying sound from the valley floor below. Dasan stopped. He held up a hand. Helen froze. "What is it?" "Listen," Dasan commanded. Faintly, rhythmically, came the sound of hooves. Not a single horse, but several. They were moving at a walk, keeping a steady pace. They were far enough back to be out of sight around the bend, but close enough to track. Dasan's eyes darkened. He looked at the tracks they had left in the deep snow, a clear, undeniable highway leading straight to Helen's cabin. "Crow's men?" Helen asked, fear tightening her throat. "Are they coming to drive you out?" Dasan shook his head slowly. He looked at the surrounding ridges, his warrior's instinct reading the landscape, calculating the angles of ambush. "If they wanted to drive us out, they would have done it in the street," Dasan said. "They are not following to scare us. Helen, they are following to finish what they started 5 years ago." He looked at her, and for the first time, Helen realized that the danger was not just about the 2 men she had saved. "They do not just fear us," Dasan said, his voice low and dangerous as a growl. "They want something else. And tonight, they will come to take it." The return to the high valley was not a retreat. It was a deployment. By the time Helen and the 2 men reached the cabin, the sun had dipped behind the granite peaks, casting long, bruised shadows across the snow. The silence of the wilderness had returned, but to Helen, it no longer felt empty. It felt watchful. Dasan did not rest. While Helen helped Greyhawk into the warmth of the cabin and administered the first dose of the bitter quinine, the younger man moved with a restless, predatory energy. He did not sit. He did not take off his boots. "Stay away from the windows," Dasan commanded, his voice low. He went outside. Helen watched through the crack in the shutter as he moved around the perimeter of the cabin. He was reading the snow like a ledger. When he returned 10 minutes later, his face was grim. "Tracks," he said, stamping the snow from his moccasins. "2 riders. They came last night while the storm was high." They circled the barn. They stood by the woodpile. Helen felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. "Crow's men. Hired hands." Dasan replied. "They were scouting, checking your defenses. They saw only a woman living alone. They did not expect me." He began to turn the cabin into a fortress. He took the heavy axe and cut lengths of firewood into sturdy braces, jamming them against the doorframe. He checked the shutters, reinforcing the latches with strips of rawhide he produced from his pack. He moved with an efficiency that spoke of a lifetime of war. For the next 2 days, the cabin became a strange, suspended world. Outside, the winter cold was absolute. Inside, the heat of the fire and the proximity of 3 bodies created a tense, intimate atmosphere. Greyhawk's fever broke on the second night. The quinine and the willow bark tea, combined with the warmth, pulled him back from the edge. By the 3rd afternoon, he was sitting up, propped against the pillows on the rug. Helen sat beside him, mending a tear in Dasan's buckskin shirt while the giant chopped wood outside. The rhythmic thwack of the axe was a steady heartbeat in the afternoon silence. "You have good hands," Greyhawk said, his voice raspy but clear. He watched her needle flash in the firelight. "Hands that know work, hands that know pain. They are just hands," Helen said softly, not looking up. "My son likes your hands," the old man said. Helen pricked her finger. A tiny bead of blood bloomed on her thumb. She looked at Greyhawk, startled. The old man's eyes were dark and knowing, crinkled at the corners with a lifetime of squinting at the sun. "He does not say it," Greyhawk continued. "He carries a mountain of anger, but he watches you. He sees that you are like the willow. You bend in the wind, but you do not break." He coughed, a dry sound, and took a sip of water. "We were like that once, the people. We bent, we moved." "Why are you running?" Helen asked. "Dasan said you are going to Mexico. We are running from a lie," Greyhawk said. His face grew somber, the lines deepening. 3 moons ago, our village was in the lowlands, near the San Carlos agency. We were at peace. We had ration tickets. We had no guns." He looked into the fire, seeing ghosts. Men came in the night. They rode horses with iron shoes. They wore the paint of the Apache, but they did not scream like the Apache. They laughed. They burned the wiki-ups. They shot the women as they ran. My wife, Dasan's mother, she fell by the river. Helen stopped sewing. The room seemed to tilt. "The newspapers," Greyhawk whispered. "They wrote that it was a war between tribes. They said we were savages killing each other. But I saw them. I saw a man with a red beard wipe the paint from his face. They were white men. They wanted the water rights to the valley. So they created a massacre to drive us out." Helen felt the blood drain from her face. Her hands began to tremble so violently she had to set the needle down. 5 years ago," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "My husband, Silas." Greyhawk turned his gaze to her. His eyes filled with a sudden, sharp understanding. "The fire?" he asked. "They said it was Apaches," Helen said, the words tumbling out, brittle and sharp. "The sheriff said he found arrows. He said they came down from the ridge. But I never saw them. I only heard the horses. And the laughter. It was a terrible, high laugh. Like a coyote, but wrong. Men who play at being wolves," Greyhawk said. "It is the same story. Daughter, different land, same greed." The door opened, and Dasan entered, bringing with him a gust of cold air and the scent of pine resin. He carried an armful of wood. He stopped when he saw Helen's face, pale and stricken. "What is it?" he asked, dropping the wood into the bin. "The fire," Greyhawk said to his son. "Her husband. It was the chameleon men." Dasan went still. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He looked at Helen, his expression shifting from suspicion to a profound, dark intensity. "Show me," Dasan said. "Show you what?" Helen asked. "The place where he died. The ashes." The ruins of the main ranch house were a scar on the white landscape, a few hundred yards from the cabin. The snow had covered the blackened timbers, turning the mounds of debris into soft, white shapes, like graves. Helen stood by the remains of the chimney, her arms wrapped around herself against the biting wind. Dasan moved through the wreckage. He dug through the snow and the layers of 5-year-old ash with his bare hands. He moved the rotted beams, sifting through the charcoal and the rusted iron of bed frames and stove parts. "The sheriff said he found arrows," Helen said, her voice lost in the wind. "He took them, He would take what fits his story. Dasan said. He was kneeling near what used to be the front porch. But the earth keeps its own secrets. He dug deeper, down to the layer of hard-packed dirt that had been beneath the floorboards. He sifted the grit through his fingers. Suddenly, he stopped. He stood up and walked over to Helen. He held out his hand. Lying in his palm was a small, tarnished cylinder of brass. It was green with verdigris, but the shape was unmistakable. A spent rifle cartridge. "This is not Apache," Dasan said. "We use what we have, but 5 years ago, this was new, a 44-40 centerfire. Expensive." He rubbed the base of the casing with his thumb, cleaning away the grime. He held it up to the pale winter sun. "Look." Helen leaned in. There, scratched deeply into the brass near the rim, was a jagged mark. An X with a circle around it. "A maker's mark?" she asked. "No," Dasan said, his voice cold as the ice on the eaves. "A counting mark. Some men mark their bullets so they know which ones they fired, or to claim their kills." He closed his hand over the brass, his knuckles turning white. "I have seen this mark before. The man who killed my mother. He reloaded his own shells. He sat by the fire after the slaughter and carved this mark into the brass. I watched him from the reeds where I hid." The connection slammed into Helen like a physical blow. The same men, the same method. Elias Crow did not just want the land. He employed a death squad that had been operating for years, clearing the territory for his ambition, painting their crimes in the colors of a race war. "They killed Silas," Helen whispered. The grief that she had buried under layers of numbness exploded. It was hot and sharp, but it was quickly overtaken by a rage that matched the fire in Dasan's eyes. "They killed him for dirt." "For gold," Dasan corrected. "The railroad is gold." He looked at the tree line, his eyes narrowing. "Come, we are too exposed here." They turned to head back to the cabin. The sun was setting, painting the sky in violent streaks of crimson and violet. They were halfway across the open yard when the silence shattered. Crack! The sound was sharp, flat, and instant. A spray of snow erupted from the ground 2 inches from Helen's boot. "Down!" Dasan roared. He did not wait for her to react. He launched himself at her. His massive weight hit her, driving the breath from her lungs, and tackled her into the deep snow. Crack thud. A second bullet buried itself in the earth where she'd been standing a second before. Dasan rolled, taking Helen with him, covering her body with his own. He was heavy, a wall of muscle and buckskin, pressing her down into the frozen powder. "Crawl!" he hissed in her ear. "To the woodpile!" They scrambled through the snow, Helen's heart hammering against the ground. They threw themselves behind the stack of oak logs Dasan had cut earlier. "Stay down," Dasan ordered. He pulled the heavy Colt revolver from his belt. "Do not move your head." He peered through a gap in the logs. "Where are they?" Helen gasped, wiping snow from her eyelashes. "The ridge," Dasan said. 300 yards. A Sharp's rifle. Long range." He did not fire back. The range was too far for a pistol. He looked at the cabin, 50 yards away. The door was shut. "I'm going to draw his fire," Dasan said calmly, as if discussing the weather. "When I move, you run for the porch. Do not look back." "No." Helen grabbed his arm. His skin was cold from the snow, but burning underneath. "You will be killed." Dasan looked at her. His face was inches from hers. She could see the flecks of gold in his obsidian eyes. She could smell the scent of pine and old leather. For a second, the gunfire did not matter. "He cannot kill what he cannot catch," Dasan said. "Run!" He surged up from behind the woodpile, sprinting not toward the cabin, but laterally, toward the barn, yelling a war cry that echoed off the valley walls. Boom! The heavy rifle on the ridge roared. Snow exploded behind Dasan's heels. Helen ran. She scrambled up the porch steps and threw herself through the door, grabbing her husband's Winchester from the rack. She spun around, leveling the rifle through the window. Dasan had reached the barn. He disappeared inside. A moment later, the hayloft door flew open. Dasan appeared, not with a pistol, But with an old buffalo gun Helen kept for bears. He had found it. He braced the heavy weapon on the ledge. Boom! Dasan's shot thundered, a plume of smoke erupting from the loft. On the ridge, a man shouted. There was a scrambling sound, then the noise of a horse breaking into a gallop, fading away into the dusk. Silence returned to the valley. Helen stood by the window, shaking, the Winchester still raised. She watched the barn. "Dasan?" she whispered. He walked out of the barn a moment later. He was walking slowly. He held his left arm close to his side. Helen threw the door open and ran to him. "Inside," he said through gritted teeth. In the cabin, Greyhawk was awake, gripping a knife, his eyes alert. "They are gone," Dasan said. He sat heavily on the bench by the table. Blood was seeping through the fringe of his buckskin shirt, dark and wet. "You are hit," Helen said. She dropped the rifle and rushed to the basin, pouring water and grabbing a clean cloth. "Let me see." "It is a scratch," Dasan grunted. "Be quiet," Helen ordered. Her fear had transmuted into a fierce, singular focus. She took her knife and cut away the sleeve of his shirt. The bullet had furrowed a deep groove across the deltoid muscle of his left arm. It was bleeding freely, but it had missed the bone. "The spirits favor fools," Greyhawk murmured from the rug, though his relief was palpable. "Hold this," Helen commanded Dasan, pressing a pad of cloth to the wound. He hissed, a sharp intake of breath, but he did not pull away. She worked quickly, cleaning the wound with whiskey and water. Her hands, usually so steady, were trembling slightly. Dasan watched her. He watched the way her brow furrowed in concentration. He watched the way the firelight caught the stray strands of hair that had escaped her bun. The air in the room grew thick again, but this time it was not with fear. It was heavy with the heat of survival. When Helen finished binding the wound with strips of white linen, she did not immediately pull away. Her hand lingered on his shoulder, her fingers brushing the old, raised scar that ran down his bicep. She looked up. Dasan was looking at her. His face was open, unguarded for the first time. The adrenaline of the fight had stripped away the stoicism. His chest heaved with exertion. They were close, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. She could smell the iron scent of fresh blood and the musk of his skin. Her hand rested on his bare arm. His skin was rough, weathered by wind and sun, but warm, alive. Dasan reached out with his good hand. He covered hers. His hand engulfed hers, his calloused palm rough against her knuckles. He did not pull her hand away. He pressed it against his skin, as if he needed to feel the reality of her touch. Helen's breath hitched in her throat. She looked at his mouth. It was a hard mouth, unsmiling, but she wondered, with a sudden, shocking intensity, what it would taste like. The silence stretched, taut as a bowstring. The violence outside had stripped away the social veneer. Here, in the firelight, there was no widow and no savage. There was only a man and a woman who had just cheated death together. Dasan leaned in, just a fraction of an inch. His eyes dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes. The question was there. The hunger was there. It was raw and terrifying and beautiful. Helen felt tears prick her eyes. The sheer relief of being alive, mixed with this overwhelming, forbidden pull, was too much. She let out a small, broken sob. Dasan stopped. The spell did not break, but it shifted. The hunger in his eyes softened into something infinitely gentler. He pulled her into him. It was not a kiss. He wrapped his good arm around her waist and pulled her against his chest. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, breathing in the scent of her hair. Helen clung to him. She buried her face in his shoulder, uncaring of the blood. She felt the solid thud of his heart against hers. It was strong. It was steady. They stayed like that for a long time, holding each other in the center of the room while the old man watched from the shadows. Wise enough to say nothing, finally. Dasan pulled back. He kept his hand on her waist for a moment longer than necessary before letting go. "They will be back," he said. His voice was husky. "With more men. That was a test. The next time, it will be a siege." Helen wiped her face with her apron. She felt flushed, her skin tingling where he had touched her. She forced herself to think, to be the woman who had survived 5 winters alone. "They want us to run," Helen said. "Crow thinks fear will make me sign the deed." "We must leave," Dasan said. "Tonight, I will take my father. We will draw them south. You go to the town. Tell them we forced you. Tell them you are innocent. You will be safe." Helen looked at the brass casing sitting on the table where Dasan had left it. She looked at the bloody bandage on his arm. "No," she said. Dasan frowned. "Helen, you do not understand. These men are killers." "I understand perfectly," Helen said. Her voice was cold, harder than iron. "They killed my husband. They tried to kill you. They want my home. If you leave, they will kill you on the road. And then they will come back for me anyway." She walked to the table and picked up the brass casing. She held it up to the firelight. "This is not just a bullet," she said. "This is a noose. If we can prove this came from Crow's men, if we can prove the massacre was a lie, the federal marshals will hang them." "The law in Red Hollow is Pike," Dasan said. "He owns the law." "Pike is the sheriff," Helen said. "But the circuit judge arrives in 3 days. Judge Sterling. He is a hard man, but he hates Elias Crow. He has been trying to catch Crow in a land swindle for years." She turned to Dasan. "We do not run," she said. "We go back to Red Hollow, not to beg for medicine, to bring justice." Dasan looked at her. He saw the transformation. The scared widow was gone. In her place was a woman who looked like she could command armies. "It is a trap," Dasan said. "Walking into the lion's den." "Then we bring our own teeth," Helen replied. Later that night, the cabin was dark. Dasan was on watch by the window. Greyhawk slept. Helen sat at the table, her hand resting over the brass casing. She traced the jagged X with her fingertip. She looked over at Dasan's silhouette against the faint moonlight filtering through the shutter. She remembered the feel of his arms around her. She remembered the heat. She whispered into the darkness, a vow to the empty room and the ghost of the husband she had loved. "If I stay silent this time, I will stay silent forever." She closed her fingers around the brass. No more silence. The dawn did not break with the promise of light. It broke with the sound of a gathering storm that had nothing to do with the weather. Helen was awake before the sun crested the peaks. She had not slept. She sat by the window, the Winchester rifle resting across her lap, watching the valley floor emerge from the darkness. The snow was a pristine, blinding white sheet, but as the light grew, she saw the dark smudge moving up the trail. It was not a patrol. It was an army. "They are coming," she said. Her voice was flat, stripped of fear, leaving only a cold, hard resolve. Dasan was instantly at her side. He did not look through the crack in the shutter. He listened. The sound of hooves crunching through the crust of the snow, the jingle of bit chains, and the low murmur of men's voices drifted up on the thin mountain air. "How many?" Dasan asked. 20, maybe 30, Helen replied. "And Pike is leading them." She stood up and moved to the table where Greyhawk lay. The old man was awake, his eyes bright with fever and knowledge. He knew what that sound meant. It was the sound that had followed his people across the desert and into the mountains for generations. "Help him up," Helen said to Dasan. "If we are to die today, we will die standing." By the time the riders reached the clearing in front of the cabin, the sun was fully up, casting harsh shadows across the snow. The men fanned out in a semicircle, blocking the only path down the mountain. They were a motley collection of ranch hands, town drunks, and scared shopkeepers, all armed, all shivering in the cold, their breath pluming in the air like smoke from dragon nostrils. At the center sat Sheriff Harlan Pike on a large bay gelding. Beside him, mounted on a sleek black thoroughbred, was Elias Crow. Crow looked impatient, his eyes darting to the barn, then to the cabin, calculating angles. Some of the men carried rifles. Others, Helen noted with a sick feeling in her stomach, carried coils of heavy hemp rope lashed to their saddles. They had not come for an arrest. They had come for a lynching. Helen May Dawson, Pike's voice boomed across the yard, echoing off the canyon walls. "This is the law. Come out with your hands empty." Inside the cabin, the air was thick with tension. Dasan checked the load in his heavy buffalo gun. He looked at Helen. "There is a loose board in the back wall of the pantry," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I loosened it last night. I can slip out. I will draw their fire toward the ridge. In the confusion, you stay inside. They will not shoot a white woman if the target is running." Helen looked at him. She saw the scar on his arm, the fierce set of his jaw. He was offering to trade his life for hers without a second thought. It was a noble thing. It was the warrior's way. "No," Helen said. Dasan frowned. "Helen, you cannot fight this. There are too many. If you run, they will hunt you down like a dog," Helen said, her eyes flashing. "And then they will come back and burn this cabin anyway to hide the evidence. They will say you killed me before you ran. I will not let you die for a lie." She walked to the table and picked up the spent brass cartridge casing. She shoved it into the pocket of her apron. Then she picked up a piece of charred wood she had salvaged from the ruins of the ranch house, a black, twisted remnant of the night her husband died. "We go out there," Helen said. "Together. They will shoot," Dasan warned. "Let them look me in the eye when they do it," Helen replied. She walked to the door. She did not take the rifle. She unbarred the heavy timber, the wood groaning against the iron brackets. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the scent of pine and impending violence, and threw the door open. She stepped out onto the porch. The wind whipped her skirts around her legs. She stood tall, her hands empty, looking down at the mob from the height of the steps. Behind her, in the shadow of the doorway, Dasan stepped into view, supporting Greyhawk. A ripple of shock went through the crowd. They had expected a savage cowering in the dark. Instead, they saw a giant of a man, wounded and proud, holding up a frail elder, standing behind a woman who looked not like a victim, but like a judge. "There they are," a man in the back shouted. "The killers." "Easy," Pike roared, raising a hand. He trotted his horse forward a few paces. "Helen, step away from them. You are harboring fugitives, dangerous renegades." "I am harboring guests," Helen called out, her voice clear and carrying well in the stillness. "And the only dangerous men I see are the ones surrounding a widow's home with ropes." Elias Crow spurred his horse forward, coming up beside Pike. His face was twisted in a sneer of false concern. "Helen, be reasonable," Crow said. "These men are animals. They tricked you. They are using you as a shield. Step down here, and my boys will handle the rest. We have authority from the Territorial Council to clear this threat." "What threat?" Elias, Helen asked. "An old man dying of winter sickness, a son trying to save him." "They are Apaches," a voice yelled from the crowd. "They burned the Miller place. They burned your place." Helen fixed her eyes on the man who had shouted Jeb Miller, a man who had lost 2 cows last week. "Is that what you were told?" "Jeb," Helen asked. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the brass cartridge casing. She held it up, the sun glinting off the tarnished metal. "Look at this," she commanded. The crowd shifted, confused. "5 years ago," Helen said, her voice rising, "my husband, Silas, was murdered. You all told me it was Apaches. You told me to hate them. You told me to fear them. I believed you. I lived in terror for 5 years because of what you said." She walked down one step. Pike's hand hovered over his gun. "But Apaches do not use 44-40 centerfire rounds with a hand-loaded crimp," Helen said, "and they do not mark the base of their shells with a cross and a circle." She threw the casing. It landed in the snow near the hooves of a horse ridden by a man named Vance, one of Crow's foremen. Vance went pale. He looked down at the Winchester in his scabbard, a rifle that fired that exact caliber. "I found this in the ashes of my husband's bedroom," Helen said, pointing a shaking finger at Vance. "And I found 3 more just like it yesterday, fired at this cabin by men trying to kill us, men who rode horses with shoes, men who laughed." A murmur ran through the crowd. Martha Kellum, who had ridden up in a wagon at the rear, stood up, straining to see. "What is she saying?" Martha asked loudly. "She is hysterical," Crow shouted, his composure cracking. "She has been bewitched by them, Sheriff. Do your duty. Arrest them." "Since when is it the duty of the sheriff to cover up murder?" Helen screamed. She pulled the charred piece of wood from her apron and held it up like a holy relic. "This is a piece of the house Silas built," she cried. "Burned by white men, burned by him." She pointed straight at Elias Crow. Crow's face turned a violent shade of red. The horse beneath him danced nervously, sensing his rider's rage. "You lying witch!" Crow spat. "I offered you a fair price. I gave you every chance to leave with dignity, but no, you had to cling to this worthless dirt like a stubborn mule." "Worthless?" Helen challenged. "Is it worthless, Elias, or is it the only straight path for the railroad you have been promising the investors in Chicago?" The silence that followed was absolute. The word railroad hung in the air. Sheriff Pike turned his head slowly to look at Crow. "Railroad, you told the council the land was for grazing." Crow realized his mistake. He saw the doubt in the eyes of the townsfolk. He saw his carefully constructed narrative of the Apache menace, crumbling under the weight of the truth spoken by a woman he had dismissed as weak. He panicked. "They are lying!" the Crow shrieked. "Kill them! Kill them all. It is self-defense." He drew his revolver. It was a fast, fluid motion, born of desperation. He did not aim at Helen. He aimed at the massive, dark shape looming behind her. "No!" Helen screamed. She lunged, but she was too far away. Dasan saw the gun come up. He pushed his father behind the doorframe and stepped forward, his knife flashing in his hand, ready to charge. But he was too slow. Bang! The gunshot was deafening, but Dasan did not fall. From the shadows of the doorway, a small, frail figure had launched itself forward. Greyhawk, summoning the last reserves of his strength, threw himself in front of his son. The bullet caught the old man in the chest. Greyhawk jerked back as if kicked by a mule. He collapsed onto the wooden planks of the porch, blood instantly blossoming dark and red against his buckskin shirt. "Father!" Dasan roared. The sound was not human. It was the cry of a wounded animal, full of agony and fury. Dasan dropped to his knees, gathering the old man into his arms. Crow stared, his gun still smoking. He looked stunned, as if he had not intended to pull the trigger, or perhaps he was shocked that the old man had moved so fast. He attacked me," Crow stammered. "You saw it? He lunged." Dasan looked up. His eyes were no longer human. They were pits of black fire. He gently laid his father down and stood up. He reached for the buffalo gun leaning against the wall. "Kill him!" Crow screamed at his men. "Shoot him down! He's going to kill us all!" Vance and two other hired hands raised their rifles. The rest of the townspeople hesitated, their weapons wavering. Helen saw the rifles come up. She saw Dasan stepping forward into the hail of lead that was about to come. She did not think. She moved. She threw herself between Dasan and the mob. She spread her arms wide, making herself a human cross, a barrier of flesh and wool between the Apache warrior and the guns of her neighbors. "Stop!" she screamed. The shout tore from her throat, raw and bleeding. "If you want to shoot him, you have to shoot through me." The rifles wavered. Vance lowered his barrel slightly, confused. Shooting an Indian was one thing. Shooting Helen Mae Dawson, a woman they had known since she was a girl, was another. "Get out of the way, Helen!" Pike shouted, his voice cracking. "No," Helen retorted. She stood like a statue, her chest heaving, tears streaming down her face, but her eyes were dry and burning. "Look at yourselves," she shouted at the crowd. "Look at what you are doing. You just watched a man die to save his son. A man you called a savage showed more love in 1 second than this town has shown in 5 years. She pointed at Crow, who was trying to reload his revolver with trembling hands. "That man is the murderer." Helen cried. "He killed Silas. He killed this old man, and now he wants you to kill me so he can get richer. Is that who you are? Are you his hangmen, or are you men?" She looked directly at Timmy's father, the man standing in the front row. "John," she said, "your boy gave us bread yesterday. He saw a hungry old man. What do you see? Do you see a monster? Or do you see a grieving son?" John lowered his rifle. He looked at the dead body of Greyhawk on the porch. He looked at Dasan, who was standing behind Helen, his hand gripping her shoulder, his grief vibrating through her body. "Damn it," John whispered. He uncocked his rifle. One by one, the guns began to lower. The mob mentality, so fragile and dependent on momentum, shattered against the rock of Helen's courage. "This ain't right," another man muttered. "This ain't justice." Elias Crow looked around wildly. He saw his support evaporating. He saw the way the men were looking at him now with suspicion, with disgust. "You are all cowards," the Crow screamed. "I pay you. I own this valley. Shoot them." He raised his gun again, aiming wildly at Helen. "Drop it, Elias." The voice was low, heavy, and final. Sheriff Harlan Pike had drawn his revolver, but he was not pointing it at the porch. He was pointing it at Elias Crow's head. The Crow froze. "Harlan, what are you doing?" Pike's face was pale, his jowls shaking, but his hand was steady. He looked at the body of Greyhawk. He looked at Helen, standing there with her arms spread, protecting the man he had wanted to hang. "I have turned a blind eye to a lot of things." "Elias," Pike said, his voice thick with regret. "I let you talk me into ignoring the arrows. I let you talk me into scaring her, but I never signed up for killing women. And I sure as hell never signed up for murder in plain sight. You cannot arrest me," Crow spat. "I am the council chairman. Then I guess I will be out of a job tomorrow," Pike said. "But today, you are under arrest," Crow snarled. For a split second, his eyes tightened, and his finger tightened on the trigger, swinging the barrel toward Pike. Crack! The shot did not come from Pike. It came from the porch. Dasan stood there, the buffalo gun smoking in his hands. He had fired over Helen's shoulder. The heavy lead slug hit Elias Crow in the right shoulder, shattering the bone and spinning him out of the saddle. He hit the snow with a wet thud. Screaming in agony, his pistol flying from his useless hand, Dasan did not fire again. He lowered the rifle. He looked at Pike. "He lives," Dasan said, his voice a low rumble that carried across the yard. "So, he can speak the truth to your judge." Pike looked at Crow writhing in the snow, then back at Dasan. He nodded slowly. "Vance!" Pike barked at the foreman. "Get him up. Bind his hands. If he bleeds out, that is God's will. But we are taking him to jail." The tension in the clearing broke like a fever. The men dismounted, their anger draining away, replaced by a sullen confusion and shame. They avoided looking at the porch. Helen turned to Dasan. He had dropped the rifle. He was kneeling beside his father again. The old man was gone. His face was peaceful, the lines of pain smoothed away by death. Helen knelt beside Dasan. She did not say a word. She simply reached out and placed her hand on his back, feeling the tremors of grief that shook his massive frame. The wind picked up, swirling the snow around the cabin, burying the bloodstains, covering the scars of the morning. Pike walked up to the bottom of the steps. He took off his hat, twisting the brim in his hands. "Helen," he said. His voice was rough. "Take him away, Harlan," Helen said, not looking up. "Just take him away." The sheriff nodded. He signaled his men. They loaded the screaming Elias Crow onto a wagon, one by one. The riders turned their horses and began the long trudge back down the mountain. They left the cabin as they had found it, isolated, alone in the white wilderness. But everything had changed. The silence that returned was not the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of mourning, heavy and sacred. Helen watched the last rider disappear around the bend. Then she turned to Dasan. "We need to bring him inside," she whispered. Dasan nodded. He raised his father's body with a tenderness that broke Helen's heart all over again. They carried Greyhawk into the cabin, away from the cold, away from the hatred of the world. And as Helen barred the door, she knew that the siege was over. But the hardest part, the living, was just beginning. The silence in the cabin was different now. It was not the fearful silence of a woman alone, nor the tense silence of a siege. It was the heavy, sacred silence of a vigil. Greyhawk lay on the bed that Helen had insisted he take. The buffalo robe was pulled up to his chin, but it could not hide the shallowness of his breathing or the gray pallor that had settled over his skin like the first frost of autumn. The bullet from Elias Crow's gun had done its terrible work, tearing through the old man's chest, stealing the last of his strength. Helen sat on a low stool by the bedside, a basin of warm water in her lap. She wrung out a cloth and gently wiped the sweat from the old man's forehead. Her hands, usually so steady when chopping wood or firing a rifle, trembled. Dasan stood on the other side of the bed. He had not moved for an hour. He was like a statue carved from obsidian in grief. His hand, large and scarred, covered his father's frail hand, anchoring the old man to the world of the living for just a few moments longer. Greyhawk's eyelids fluttered. He let out a breath that rattled deep in his chest. "My son," he whispered. The voice was so faint it was almost lost in the crackle of the fire. "I am here, father," Dasan said. His voice broke, the deep rumble cracking into shards of pain. Greyhawk turned his head slowly on the pillow. His dark, clouded eyes found Helen. He studied her face for a long moment, looking past the exhaustion and the soot, seeing something that Helen was only just beginning to see herself. He pulled his hand free from Dasan's grip and reached out, his fingers brushing Helen's wrist. His skin was dry and cool, like parchment. "You," Greyhawk wheezed. "You stood before the iron. I could not let them hurt you," Helen whispered, tears spilling over her lashes. "I am so sorry. I should have stopped him sooner." Greyhawk shook his head, a microscopic movement. "No, you are strong, like the mountain pine." He took a ragged breath, his chest hitching. "I give you a name," he whispered. "In the way of the people, you are Zili Naashji." Helen looked at Dasan, confused. Dasan's face softened, the grief momentarily giving way to reverence. "It means Spider-Woman," he translated softly. "But in our stories, she is not a monster. She is the weaver. She is the one who taught the people to survive. She is the keeper of the fire on the snow." Greyhawk squeezed Helen's wrist with a surprising surge of strength. "Keeper of the fire," he repeated. "Do not let it go out." He looked back at his son. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "The winter is over. Dasan, the path is clear." The old man exhaled. It was a long, slow release of air, like the wind sighing through the canyon at sunset. And then, there was no intake. The chest stilled. The hand on Helen's wrist went slack. Dasan did not wail. He did not tear his clothes. He simply bowed his head until his forehead touched his father's hand. His shoulders shook with silent, tectonic sobs that seemed to come from the very center of the earth. Helen stood up and walked to the window, giving him the dignity of his privacy. She looked out at the white valley, her heart aching with a sorrow she had not felt since the night Silas died. But this time, the sorrow was not empty. It was shared. The funeral took place the next morning. The sky was a piercing, brilliant blue, the kind that only comes after a great storm. The air was cold enough to freeze breath in the throat. They dug the grave on the south-facing slope of the ridge, overlooking the valley. It was grueling work. The ground was frozen hard as iron beneath the snow. Dasan wielded the pickaxe, swinging it with a rhythmic, savage intensity, chipping away at the earth that had claimed his father. Helen shoveled the loose dirt. They worked in silence, a team bound by sweat and loss. When the grave was deep enough, Dasan wrapped his father's body in the finest buffalo robe, the one he had carried all the way from the reservation. He placed Greyhawk on the earth, facing the rising sun. They were not alone. As Dasan began to fill the grave, Helen heard the crunch of snow. She turned, her hand instinctively going to her belt, but she relaxed when she saw who it was. It was John, the father of the boy who had given them bread. Beside him was the boy, Timmy, and two other men from the town and the blacksmith and the baker. They carried shovels. They did not carry guns. John took off his hat, twisting the brim in his red, raw hands. He walked up to the grave. looking at Dasan with a mixture of shame and respect. "We came to help," John said gruffly. If that's all right." Dasan paused, leaning on his shovel. He looked at the white men. 2 days ago, they had been part of a mob ready to hang him. Today, they stood with heads bowed. Dasan nodded once. The men stepped forward. They did not speak, but they began to shovel the land alongside the Apache warrior. The sound of soil hitting the robe was the only sound in the valley. When the mound was finished, Helen placed a simple cross made of 2 peeled pine branches at the head. Dasan placed a circle of river stones around the foot. It was a grave of 2 worlds. "I am sorry for your loss," John said to Dasan. He extended a hand. Dasan looked at the hand. It was a white man's hand. The hand of a man who had stood by while crows shouted for murder, but it was also the hand of a man who was trying to bridge a chasm. Dasan took it. The grip was brief, hard, and acknowledging. "Go in peace," Dasan said. The townsmen tipped their hats to Helen and walked back down the hill. Helen and Dasan stood alone by the fresh earth. "He is at rest," Helen said softly. "His spirit walks the spirit trail," Dasan said. He looked at the horizon. "But the living must still walk on the earth." Later that afternoon, Sheriff Harlan Pike rode up to the cabin. He did not bring a posse. He rode alone, leading a second horse that was saddled but riderless. He tied his horse to the rail and walked up the steps. He looked older than Helen remembered. The bluster, the arrogance that he wore like a badge, was gone. In its place was a weary resignation. Helen met him at the door. She did not invite him in. "Crow is in the cell," Pike said, his voice flat. "The circuit judge arrived an hour ago. He took one look at Crow's shoulder and the witness statements, and he ordered him held without bail. Crow is talking. Helen, he is blaming everyone but himself. He gave up the names of the men who burned your ranch 5 years ago. He is trying to trade them for a lighter sentence." "Will he hang?" Helen asked. "Likely," Pike said, "or he will rot in a federal prison until he is dust." Pike looked past her, into the dim interior of the cabin where Dasan was cleaning his rifle. "I wanted to say," Pike started, then stopped. He rubbed his face with a gloved hand. "I should have looked closer at those arrows. Helen, 5 years ago, I let my prejudice do the thinking for me, and because of that, a good man died yesterday. 2 good men died because of you. Harlan," Helen said unforgivingly. "Silas and Greyhawk." Pike flinched. He nodded slowly. "I know. I cannot bring them back, but I can make sure nobody bothers you again. I told the town council to back off. Your land is yours," he gestured to the spare horse. "I brought a horse," Pike said. "For him, I figured he would be wanting to move on. A man cannot walk to Mexico." He turned and walked back to his mount. He paused with one foot in the stirrup. "You are a hard woman, Helen May," Pike said. "But I reckon you are the only innocent thing left in this valley." He rode away. Helen stood on the porch, looking at the horse. It was a peace offering. Or perhaps it was a hint. "Here is the means for your problem to leave." She went inside. Dasan was packing. He had gathered his few meager belongings, his knife, a small pouch of herbs, the extra blanket Helen had given him. He was rolling them into a tight bundle. The sight of it punched a hole in Helen's chest. "What are you doing?" she asked, though she knew the answer. Dasan did not look up. He tied the leather thong around the bundle with a sharp jerk. "The sheriff brought a horse," Dasan said. "It is a good horse. Strong legs." "You are leaving," Helen stated. Dasan stood up. He seemed to fill the room, his presence so large that the cabin felt empty without him even before he was gone. "I must," he said. "Why?" Helen asked. She took a step toward him. "Crow is in jail. The town knows the truth. You are not a fugitive anymore." "I am still Apache," Dasan said. His voice was hard, edged with bitterness. "Today, they feel shame. They help dig a grave. But tomorrow, next month, when a calf goes missing, when a child gets sick, they will look at the mountain, and they will remember there is a savage living in the widow's cabin." He walked to the window, looking out at the grave on the hill. I am a lightning rod. Helen, if I stay, I bring the storm to your door. You have fought enough. You deserve peace. Peace, Helen laughed, a short, sharp sound devoid of humor. You think peace is silence. You think peace is sitting in this cabin alone, listening to the wind and waiting to die. She walked around the table and stood in front of him, forcing him to look at her. I had that peace for 5 years. Dasan, it was not peace. It was a slow death. I was a ghost in my own house. You have your land, Dasan said gently. You have your name back. I do not want the land if it is empty, Helen said. The words tumbled out before she could check them. Raw and honest. Dasan looked at her, his eyes searching her face. You are a white woman. You can find a husband, a man who can walk into town with you, a man who can give you children that the world will not spit on. I do not want a husband from that town, Helen said fiercely. I do not want a man who needs a sheriff to tell him what is right. I want— She stopped, her breath catching. What do you want? Helen, Dasan asked softly. I want the man who stood in front of a gun for me, she whispered. I want the man who carried his father through a blizzard because he loved him. I want the partner who fought back to back with me when the whole world was against us. Dasan closed his eyes. The muscle in his jaw jumped. It will be hard, he said. They will never accept us. We will be an island. Then let them stare, Helen said. Let them talk. I lived through their hatred when I was alone. Do you think I fear it when I am not? She reached out and took his hand. His fingers were rough, calloused, warm. I am tired of running. Dasan, she said. I ran from the town. You ran from the soldiers. We have both been running our whole lives. Greyhawk said the path is clear. Maybe the path is not south. Maybe the path is here. She squeezed his hand. This is my land, she said firmly. And now, it is your land too, if you want it. Dasan looked down at their joined hands. The contrast was stark, her pale skin against his bronze, her small fingers entwined with his large ones. But the fit was perfect. He looked around the cabin. He looked at the hearth where he had warmed his father. He looked at the door he had repaired. He looked at the woman who had opened that door when death was knocking. He took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of wood smoke and sage and home. He slowly uncurled his fingers from the strap of his bundle. He let the bag drop to the floor. It hit the wood with a heavy thud. I have no desire to see Mexico, Dasan said. His voice was low, intimate. He reached out and brushed a stray lock of hair from Helen's forehead. His touch was incredibly gentle, a reverence reserved for holy things. The fire is here, he said. And the keeper of the fire is here. Helen let out a breath she felt she had been holding for days. She stepped closer, closing the distance between them until she could feel the heat of his body. Then stay, she whispered. Stay more than one night. Dasan nodded. A slow determination settled over his features, replacing the look of the hunted animal. He turned and walked to the door. He opened it and looked out at the valley, at the horse Pike had left, at the fresh mound of earth on the hill. He did not walk out to the horse. Instead, he reached for the heavy wooden bar that secured the door. He picked it up and set it aside, leaving the door unbarred, open to the spring air that was just beginning to soften the winter chill. He turned back to Helen, his silhouette framed by the light of the setting sun. I stay, Dasan said, until the mountains crumble, or until someone tries to take this roof from us again. Helen smiled. It was a true smile, one that reached her eyes and banished the shadows that had lived there for so long. Let them try, she said. Outside, the sun dipped below the peaks, painting the sky in colors of victory gold and purple and a deep, enduring red. The cabin stood firm against the coming night, no longer a fortress of solitude, but a stronghold of something far more powerful. The thaw did not come gently to the high country. It came with the roar of water. The sun, which had been a pale and distant coin for so many months, suddenly burned with a new, fierce heat. The massive drifts of snow that had choked the valley began to weep. Rivulets turned into streams. and streams turned into torrents, crashing down the granite faces of the Sawtooth Range, washing away the gray memory of winter. By the time the month of May arrived, the valley floor was no longer a white tomb. It was a riot of green. The grass, fed by the meltwater, shot up thick and sweet. The cottonwoods along the creek burst into leaf, a shimmering ribbon of emerald against the red rock. The cabin, too, had changed. It no longer looked like a fortress hunkering down against a siege. It looked like a homestead. The roof had been patched with fresh cedar shakes, glowing warm in the sun. A new corral had been built to the east, larger and sturdier than the old one, holding not just Bess, but the strong roan gelding Sheriff Pike had left, and 2 Mustang mares Dasan had traded for in the lowlands. But the most striking change stood near the front gate. It was a post, carved from a single trunk of dead pine. It was not a fence post. It was a story. Dasan had spent the long evenings of late winter carving it with his hunting knife. At the top was the likeness of a hawk, its wings spread wide, watching over the valley, a silent tribute to Greyhawk. Below it were symbols Helen was slowly learning to read: the jagged line of the mountains, the spiral of the wind, and near the bottom, a spider in its web, the symbol of the weaver, the keeper of the fire. It was a mark. It told anyone who rode up that trail that this place was no longer just a white widow's claim. It was a place where 2 worlds had collided and decided to stand together. Helen Dawson walked out onto her porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She wore a dress of blue calico, the fabric crisp and bright. She no longer wore the oversized coat to hide herself. The sun was warm on her face, and for the first time in 5 years, she did not scan the tree line with fear. She scanned it with anticipation. She saw him down by the creek. Dasan was shirtless, the sun gleaming on his bronze back as he lifted a heavy stone to reinforce the bank where the spring runoff was threatening to undercut the bridge. He moved with a rhythm that was part labor, part dance. The wound on his arm had healed into a jagged scar, joining the map of others on his skin. But his movement was fluid, unhindered by pain. He paused, sensing her eyes on him. He looked up, across the 100 yards of meadow grass. He raised a hand. He did not smile. Dasan rarely smiled with his mouth, but his eyes, even at this distance, held a warmth that was hotter than the sun. Helen waved back. A feeling swelled in her chest, so full and sweet it almost hurt. It was the feeling of a life that had finally, after a long and brutal winter, begun to bloom. Their trips into Red Hollow had changed. The first time they had ridden down together after the snow melted, the town had held its breath. Helen rode Bess, sitting tall in her saddle. Dasan rode the roan, a Winchester in his scabbard, but his hands resting easy on the reins. They did not sneak in. They rode down the center of Main Street at noon. There were stairs. Certainly, in a town like Red Hollow, prejudice did not vanish like snow. It retreated into the shadows, lingering in the corners of eyes and the whispers behind hands. But there was no shouting. There were no guns drawn. The arrest of Elias Crow had broken the spine of the hate. Without his money and his agitation, the fear had lost its teeth. When Helen walked into the general store, Martha Kellum did not make a snide remark about savages. She was quiet, almost subdued. She weighed Helen's order of sugar and coffee with careful precision. The roads are clearing up nicely. Helen, Martha had said, her voice tight but polite. They are, Martha, Helen had replied evenly. It will be a good year for the grass. It was a small thing, a mundane exchange about the weather. But in that banality lay a victory. Helen was no longer the pariah. She was a customer. She was a neighbor. She was a woman who had stood down a lynch mob and won. As they were loading the supplies, John, the father of the boy Timmy, walked up. He touched the brim of his hat to Helen, then turned to Dasan. "My boy found a shed antler in the woods," John said awkwardly. He wanted to know if you could show him how to make a handle for his knife, like the one you carry." Dasan had looked at the man, measuring him. Then he nodded. "Tell the boy to bring the antler, and a sharp blade. I will show him. It was not forgiveness. It was not friendship. But it was a beginning. The cabin had become a bridge. As the spring deepened, others came. Not from the town, but from the mountains to the south. Small groups of Dasan's people, traders and travelers moving through the high passes, began to stop at the cabin. They did not come to raid. They came because they had seen the totem at the gate. They came because word had spread along the hidden trails that there was a safe harbor in the valley of the Red River. Helen learned to trade. She traded the extra corn and potatoes she had stored for cured buckskin and turquoise stones. She learned the guttural, flowing sounds of the Apache tongue. She learned that to meant water, and ko meant fire. She watched Dasan with his people. She saw the respect they gave him, not just for his size, but for his survival. He was a man who had walked into the fire and carried the flame out, and she saw the way they looked at her with curiosity. Yes, but also with a nod of recognition. She was the Spider Woman. She was the one who had opened the door. One afternoon, a rider from the town came up the trail. It was not the sheriff. It was the postal clerk, a young man who looked nervous to be so far from the safety of his counter. He handed Helen a thick envelope with the seal of the territorial court. Helen sat on the porch steps to open it. Dasan came up from the corral, wiping his hands on a rag, and stood beside her. He did not read English well, but he knew the weight of paper. Helen read the letter silently. Her eyes scanned the dense legal language, the wherefores and whereases, until she reached the final paragraph. She let out a breath she felt she had been holding for 5 years. Her shoulders sagged, the paper trembling in her hand. "What does it say?" Dasan asked quietly. "It says Elias Crow has been indicted by the federal grand jury," Helen said, her voice thick with emotion. "For land fraud, for conspiracy to commit murder, and for the wrongful death of Silas Dawson." She looked up at Dasan, tears brimming in her eyes. "It says, the official record has been amended. The burning of the Dawson Ranch is no longer listed as an Apache raid. It is listed as a criminal act by hired bandits." Dasan placed his hand on her shoulder. The weight of it was grounding. "The lie is dead," he said. "Yes," Helen whispered. "Silas is clear. His name is clean." She looked out at the ruins of the old ranch house. The grass was growing over the blackened beams now, softening the scars. It was no longer a crime scene. It was just history. "And they are sending a surveyor," Helen added, looking back at the letter. "To mark the lines for the railroad right-of-way. They are offering a contract, a fair price for the easement across the lower pasture." "You will sell?" Dasan asked. "I will sell the easement," Helen said firmly. "But I will keep the land. This valley is not for sale." She folded the letter and put it in her pocket. It was over. The ghost that had haunted this valley, the ghost of injustice, had finally been laid to rest. That evening, the air was soft and smelled of sagebrush and cooling earth. They had eaten supper on the porch, watching the stars come out one by one over the ridge. Now, they sat inside. The door opened to the night. A small fire crackled in the hearth, not for heat, but for the comfort of the light. Helen sat on the rug, her legs tucked under her. Dasan sat in the chair he had made, whittling a piece of cedar. The shavings curled away from his knife, releasing a sharp, sweet scent. It was a domestic scene, simple, quiet. But the air between them was charged with a different kind of electricity than the fear of winter. It was the hum of two people who had orbited each other for months, drawn closer and closer by the gravity of survival and respect, until they had finally collided. Dasan stopped whittling. He set the knife and the wood down on the table. He looked at Helen. The firelight danced on his face, softening the sharp angles, illuminating the depth of his eyes. "The corn is planted," Dasan said. "Yes," Helen replied. "And the fence is fixed." "The horses are fat," Dasan continued. "They are," Helen agreed. Her heart began to beat faster. She knew what he was saying. The work of survival was done. The emergency was over. There were no more excuses. Dasan leaned forward. resting his elbows on his knees. "I told you I would stay until the storm passed, until no one tried to take this roof from you." Helen looked at him. "The storm is gone, Dasan. The crow is in a cage. The town leaves us alone." "Then my promise is kept," Dasan said. A cold stone dropped into Helen's stomach. "Are you saying—" "You want to go?" Dasan did not answer immediately. He looked at her hands, resting in her lap. He looked at the curve of her neck. He looked at her mouth. "I am saying," Dasan murmured, his voice dropping to a register that vibrated in Helen's bones, "that I am no longer here to guard a house. I am no longer here to pay a debt for a night of shelter." He stood up. He moved to the rug and knelt in front of her. He was so big that he blocked out the firelight, casting her in his shadow. But it was a warm shadow. "I am here," Dasan said, "because when I look at the mountains, I see emptiness, but when I look at you, I see home." Helen let out a soft sound, a half-sob, half-laugh. "Do you remember that night?" she whispered. "The wind was screaming. You looked like a giant out of a nightmare." "And you look like a spirit," Dasan said. A small, rare smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Standing there with your little rifle, shaking like a leaf, but eyes like steel." "You asked me a question," Helen said. "I asked if we could stay one night." Dasan nodded. "We thought it was just about survival," Helen said. She reached out and placed her hand on his chest, right over his heart. She could feel the slow, powerful rhythm of it. But it was not just one night, was it? It was a lifetime compacted into a storm. She leaned forward. She rested her forehead against his shoulder. For the first time, the gesture was completely natural. There was no hesitation, no calculation of safety. It was the simple, magnetic pull of a woman toward the man she loved. Dasan reached around her. He pulled the quilt from the floor and draped it over both of their shoulders, cocooning them together in a single tent of warmth. His arm tightened around her waist, pulling her flush against him. "Helen," he breathed into her hair. She lifted her head. She looked into his obsidian eyes and saw her own reflection there. She saw the woman she had become strong, chosen, loved. She did not wait for him. She reached up, her hands tangling in the long, coarse black hair at the nape of his neck. She pulled his face down to hers. The kiss was slow. It was not the frantic, desperate collision of the night they were shot at. It was deep, deliberate, and devastatingly tender. It tasted of wood smoke and coffee and the sweet, dark promise of the future. It was a conversation without words, a pouring of one soul into another. Dasan's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was rough with calluses, but gentle as a moth's wing. Helen opened to him, her breath hitching as she felt the strength of him, the sheer, solid reality of him pressing against her. In that kiss, the last walls of the cabin dissolved. The last bricks of her fortress of solitude crumbled into dust. She realized then, with a clarity that shone brighter than the fire, that she had lived alone for years, not because she was forced to, but because she had believed the lie that she was broken. She had believed she was cursed, but she was not broken. She was tempered. She was not cursed. She was chosen. She pulled back just an inch, their foreheads resting together, their breath mingling in the small space beneath the quilt. "I am not the widow Dawson anymore," she whispered. "No." Dasan agreed, his voice husky. "You are the keeper of the fire. And you," she said, tracing the scar on his shoulder, "are the one who brought the spark." They sat there for a long time as the fire burned down to embers, holding each other, listening to the creek rushing in the darkness outside. They did not need to speak of marriage, or vows, or the opinions of the town. The covenant between them had been sealed in blood and snow, and now it was sealed in love. The next morning broke with a symphony of birdsong. The light streamed through the open window, painting the floorboards in gold. Helen woke alone in the bed. For a second, a panic seized her, the old, familiar panic of abandonment. But then she heard it, the low, rhythmic murmur of a voice speaking to horses. She threw back the quilt and walked to the door in her nightdress, her hair tumbling down her back. Dasan was in the corral. He was brushing the roan gelding, the sun catching the dust motes dancing in the air. He looked up as she stepped onto the porch. He did not wave this time. He just looked at her, a look of profound, quiet possession. He belonged to this place, and this place belonged to him. Helen leaned against the doorframe. She looked back into the cabin. The fire was banked, ready to be stirred to life. The two coffee cups sat side by side on the table. The blanket they had wrapped around themselves the night before lay draped over the chair, holding the shape of their bodies. It was a scene of a life being lived, a life shared. She looked back at Dasan. He had paused in his work, waiting for her. She smiled. It was a smile of absolute, terrifying freedom. "Dasan," she called out. He cocked his head. "Yes," Helen's voice rang out across the green valley, echoing off the rocks, chasing away the last ghosts of the past. "You can stay," she said. "You can stay much more than one night." Dasan's laugh, deep and rich, rolled across the meadow. He turned back to the horse, but Helen saw the lightness in his shoulders. The narrator's voice, old and cracked like dry leather, seemed to whisper one last time in the wind. "The West is a big place. It is a hard place, full of sharp rocks and sharper men. It is a land where justice is often just a word, and survival is a daily gamble. But sometimes, in the middle of all that wildness, in a small cabin tucked away in a valley of storms, freedom manages to take root, and usually, it does not start with a law, or a gun, or a war. It starts with something much simpler. It starts with the courage to open a door in the dark and let a stranger in. Thank you, dear listeners, for riding along on this trail with me. It has been a long journey from the first snowflake to the final green blade of grass. I am grateful you stayed by the fire to hear the tale of Helen and Dasan. I would love to know where you folks are listening from today. Are you in the city dreaming of the mountains? Or are you out in the country yourself? Leave a comment down below and share your thoughts on the story. Did Helen make the right choice? If you enjoyed this yarn, please hitch your horse to the post and subscribe to Wild West Tales. Give that like a video button a tap. And if you are feeling generous, hit that hype button to help this story drift on the wind to more listeners. Until next time, keep your powder dry and your door open to the right kind of strangers.